Heartbeat Podcast, a podcast about health, politics, and society. Welcome. In this episode, we're actually going to look at the bigger picture of the COVID 19 pandemic here in Namibia. Here in the Namibian studios, we have covered the COVID 19 pandemics from the very beginning in March until now. From those early days when we just had a few cases to now being the African country with the highest rate of COVID 19 infections in terms of number of infections per day, there have been a lot of stories. What are actually the larger narratives behind these stories? We'll be exploring this question today with our special guest from the University of Indiana, PhD student in history, Liam Kingsley. So stay tuned for that. Welcome back to Heartbeat Podcast. Now we'll turn to what some of our listeners have to say about the curfew. Listen to this.
If caught by the police after 8 o'clock, I would obviously tell them I am coming from the state house. And if they ask for a letter of like being a essential worker, I will have to tell them that I misplaced it. That's all. But they will let me go.
Welcome back to Heartbeat Podcast. So, that is what our listeners have to say about the 8 p.m. curfew that was introduced in Namibia a few weeks ago in order to curb the growing number of COVID 19 infections in the Khomas region. So, from that, let us now turn to our special guest, Liam Kingsley, who will speak to us about narratives and pandemics. I'm really glad to be joined with Liam James Kingsley, who's a PhD student in the Department of History and African Studies at the University of Indiana in Indiana, the United States. He's in his office. If only you could see him, ladies. He's really bespoke, scholarly looking. He's got the glasses, the mustache. Hi, Liam.
Hey Pancho, you indeed flatter me. I think my look is much more based on what quarantine has done to me than anything else. But I'll take your compliment.
So, Liam, you have been in Namibia. When was the last time you were in Namibia, and why do you come down here?
Yeah, unfortunately, the last time I was in Namibia, Windhoek specifically, was the summer of 2019. So it's been over a year. Or winter rather. I've been coming to Namibia every winter for a few years, and obviously coronavirus got in the way of that this year. Hopefully, I'll be back sometime in 2021. But of course, time serves to see what travel is possible. But it's been sad to be away for so long.
So, Liam, from Indiana University, can you tell us about narratives and how that actually puts in perspective what has happened to Namibia with COVID 19? Because in Namibia, we see statistics and we hear about them. The number of cases is increasing. We've moved from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3 to stage 4 and back to stage 3 measures, curfews, justifications as to why we have to be locked down. What is this bigger picture?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic question, and it cuts right to the heart of how we understand diseases and the relationships between epidemics and states. Narratives are really the sort of stories that we tell ourselves or tell each other, but critically in the circumstance of epidemics, what narratives do are they are tools by which a state or a government or a society gives its people a way to understand disease and the frequently severe ramifications of the disease and the severe changes in routine and activities that people are forced to undergo in order to cope with a disease. And so narratives become really critical tools. for example, here in the States, right, at the beginning of coronavirus, when everybody was like going indoors and quarantining, but like so many healthcare workers had to go and go be on the front lines fighting this thing, there was a really popular narrative that was sort of sold to everyone about how they were heroes and they were sort of the soldiers on the front lines of the war of coronavirus. But I think a really critical thing to observe in these circumstances is that narratives only function insofar as they are readable against the actual material lived
Right.
experiences that people have. And I think this is where challenges come to be, right? Like in the States in particular, right, as we like have created this narrative about the heroism of healthcare workers, of teachers, of shopkeepers. That was a really effective narrative at the very beginning, but now that we are 6 months into the pandemic and the government itself has failed to actually do anything material to improve these people's lives rather than just give them these sort of this sort
Right.
of empty praise, the
Right.
narrative sort of wears and frays. And this is, I think, the difficulty. And you know, in the case of Namibia as well, it's a challenge also because once you set a narrative, it's hard to retract it and
Right.
alter it and change it. And
Well,
so in the case of Namibia going from stage 4 back to stage 3, the president declaring that in fact the country will open to tourists in September, and people being kind of confused about why that would be a thing that was wise to do. These sorts of the narratives are neat and tidy and they're helpful for accomplishing society-wide change, but in the margins of the actual need to address an epidemic where there needs to be a lot of tinkering and change and nimbleness, they can often fray and sometimes lead to contradictory issues that might not otherwise have arisen.
so just to break it down for our listeners, so a narrative succinctly and briefly, what is it actually? Is it a story or is it?
I think a narrative is a story, and I think part of the problem that I'm addressing here is that narrative, in the way that we use it to explain our worlds to ourselves and to others, tend to be linear. We've written into our narratives this sort of notion of progress and of marching forward, of time ever working toward some goal. But in truth, that's not necessarily the case. Like the progress and change over time are simply things that occur as a result of human agency and action. And so when our narratives find us, when we set narratives, but then we find ourselves, as is in the case right now, as Namibia has moved back to stage 3 as of just a few days ago, that contradicts the narrative we have in our mind. And so it becomes increasingly difficult to convince large groups of people to engage in the sacrifices and difficulties that they need to in order to accomplish the things that needs to be accomplished for society to continue to function and
And
to
I wanted to just ask you, what are
please.
some of the narratives that have been used by governments to legitimate some of these very restrictive measures? If you can give us just one example.
That's a great. So, I mean, to me, thinking specifically about the U.S. context, one of the narratives that we've been sold here is that we have to make sacrifices to reopen the economy. That the economy is this sort of like North Star that needs to be yes, this epidemic is a huge crisis, but it would be a worse crisis if the economy were to be irreparably damaged.
So
And so what we need
isn't the notion that you have to choose between the economy and saving lives a narrative in and of itself?
Exactly. And that's precisely it. That's the narrative that we've been sold, which of course is foundationally at its root false, right? Economies are nothing more than the labor of individuals. People are economies. And our economies are also just our faith
Right.
in value and money and what we understand money
And I
to
think
be.
that's also a narrative we've been reading about in the Namibian, in the opinion pages, and also in some of the letters that, the lockdown is good, but, our economy is really important, and if not more important. So that's a narrative that you're doing something to stop transmission, but you're hurting the economy. So it's actually a narrative. It's not a fact. And I also wanted
Precisely.
to bring out, a narrative that we heard just this morning on the 21st of August, that we have a curfew in Namibia for the first time since uh, in the new Namibia, as you know, during Southwest African times, there was a curfew, and now we have a curfew again. And one of the justifications is that it's necessary to stop the proliferation of alcohol use and gatherings based on around alcohol. So one of the things that I actually heard this morning at a press conference at the Commerce Regional Council was that after 6 p.m., when the official closing time for alcohol establishments has been in stage 4, people would start selling alcohol at the vegetable stands and car washes. So the reason that the curfew is there to stop people from doing that. And that's another narrative, that people are so industrious and so desperate to sell alcohol that they'll even do so at places where you wouldn't expect alcohol to be sold.
And I think it also speaks to what when you see in places like this, right, where the narrative sort of comes into conflict with people's lived experiences in an economy that's shut down, right? These narratives wear thin when they like grate on reality. And in truth, in Namibia, as is in the United States, there is a gross amount of income inequality. And so for people who are sort of on the fringes of that, they are sort of not in a situation in which they can quarantine or social distance in a way that doesn't lead them directly into starvation or things like the actual participation in economies, whether they're informal or formal, is actually like a day-to-day concern that
Right.
without any sort of government intervention that directly hands people money is going to lead people to find whatever way they can to contradict it. And the state, of course, can intervene and say, like, people are sort of being immoral here. They're focusing on alcohol. And of course, that's an issue that, like, people are sympathetic. They don't want drunk people in the streets. They don't want this sort of thing. But in truth, it's people really need money. And like, if selling alcohol is going to get them money, they're going to do it. And it's in these places that you see it all sort of fall apart, right? Like, how powerful can what can social distancing mean to somebody that lives in like an informal township like Havana or something like that, and where distancing can't really function?
Right. And I wanted to ask you a fascinating question. You are a historian. Can you please briefly compare and contrast what it means to have a curfew now in Namibia as opposed to before 1990?
Certainly. Well, I mean, I'm sure this is the sort of thing that SWAPO and the state heavily thought about before they instituted this sort of thing, because the historical memory of curfews is not a positive one, especially in the region, like the Arango region and the Kamas region, which had previously been in the police zone, where there's all this increased level of state control over space. And of course, you think immediately, when you think of pre-independence Namibia, of apartheid and the way that space was racialized and separated and controlled, where everyone had been moved out of the old location into Katutura, so that control was something that was more easily articulated. Obviously, raising that specter is something that is very fraught, and I'm sure it's something that the government is like being very careful to think through. But like, here we are again, right? Like, it may not, certainly, like that history exists, but like the sort of class divisions that are present in society still to this day, that in some ways sort of were rooted in that social structure of apartheid that was never totally undone, lead it to be the case that this curfew, like other things, are going to affect certain people more severely than other people.
Right. So you're basically saying the curfew is still going to harken back to the past, because some people, especially the poor people, are really going to suffer more from it than the wealthy. Uh, yeah, thank you. And to end off, I really want to ask you, what any story or any narrative that you would recommend for us to read in this time of lockdown when we can't really go out?
Mm. Well, I've certainly been reading a lot more fiction than I normally do now that I'm stuck at home all the time. But I would really recommend a book that I read a few years ago and really enjoyed, Albert Camus' The Plague. And I think there's a lot in there that either tells us something about what we're experiencing today, certainly tells us something about narrative and how we understand disease, but also gives us some things to push back against. In some ways, I think Camus saw epidemics, and he's talking about a plague outbreak in Oran in Algeria, and a fictionalized account of this, where they shut down the city, they quarantine, no one's allowed in or out, and they just deal with the plague. For him, I think he sees epidemics as a time of opportunity. And I think that's, while epidemics are inherently tragic and bad, they are also times of crisis in which things can either get consolidated to go worse, right? Money and as is happening in the United States, right, money can get filtered into the hands of the rich people and taken away from the impoverished, and that can happen in times of epidemic. But epidemics are also times when people all recognize simultaneously the fault lines in society. Because if epidemics do one thing, they reveal the fault lines that already existed in society and widen them. And I think solidarity among people who were already suffering but now suffer more acutely under an epidemic creates an opportunity for change that might have not previously existed, and draws out the faults in Namibian healthcare system, the widening class inequity in the country, and things like this that might have otherwise lingered there but not been as plainly evident. And I think Camus' sort of absurdist, sort of almost strange hope that he views this plague epidemic through in the plague sort of reminds us of that in an important way.
And how do we spell his name for our listeners? It's Albert.
That is, yeah, Albert, Albert, Camus, Camus.
Yes. So I hope that our listeners will search for that and purchase that. So thank you so much, Liam, for this interview.
Thank you so much, Pancho. It's always a pleasure hearing from you and talking.
So that was our interview with PhD student Liam Kingsley. So if you find yourself in a difficult situation, whether it is that you have been economically affected by the pandemic, your family, or you're even in isolation, perhaps think of it as part of a larger narrative, a larger story that we hope will actually have an ending worth writing about. So thank you so much. Pancho Molongeni, signing off.